The December wind cut through the wire fencing of Camp Alva, Oklahoma, carrying with it the scent of snow and the distant sound of church bells from the nearby town. Inside the barracks, hundreds of German prisoners of war huddled around makeshift stoves, their breath visible in the cold air as they whispered in their native tongue about home, about families they hadn't seen in years, about Christmases that seemed like memories from another lifetime. Most had arrived months earlier, transported across an ocean from the battlefields of North Africa and Italy, still wearing the remnants of Wehrmacht uniforms now patched and faded. The journey had been long, disorienting, filled with uncertainty about what awaited them in the American heartland. They had expected harsh treatment, perhaps starvation, certainly the kind of brutality that propaganda had promised would be their fate in enemy hands. Instead, they found themselves in a camp that, while still surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, operated with efficiency and order that surprised them. Regular meals, medical care, work details that paid small wages, and treatment that, while firm, lacked the cruelty they had been conditioned to expect. But nothing had prepared them for what was about to unfold in the weeks leading up to Christmas 1943. It began with an announcement during evening roll call. The camp commander, Colonel Henderson, stood before the assembled prisoners with an interpreter at his side. His weathered face, marked by years of military service, carried an expression that seemed almost uncomfortable, as if he were about to deliver news he wasn't entirely sure how to frame. "Gentlemen," he began, his words translated into German by Sergeant Muller, a German-American soldier who had volunteered for interpreter duty. "I have been asked to inform you that several American families in the surrounding communities have expressed a desire to provide Christmas gifts for prisoners in this camp." The translation hung in the cold air like a physical thing. Hundreds of faces stared back at the colonel, expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion to outright disbelief. Hans Richter, a former panzer commander from Bavaria, felt his stomach tighten. In his 3 years of military service, he had learned to distrust anything that seemed too generous, too kind. Gifts from the enemy. It had to be some sort of trick. "These gifts," the colonel continued, "are entirely voluntary donations from local churches, women's organizations and individual families. They include warm clothing, books, writing materials, and small personal items. Distribution will begin tomorrow morning." The murmur that rippled through the ranks was immediate and intense. Werner Schultz, a young infantry soldier barely 20 years old, leaned toward his bunkmate and whispered, "What do they want in return?" "Information, collaboration." His friend Otto Brenner, a veteran of the Russian front, just shook his head slowly. "Nothing comes free from the enemy," he muttered. Nothing. That night, the barracks buzzed with conversation that continued long after lights out. Men who had fought in different theaters, who came from different regions of Germany, who held different ranks and different political beliefs, found themselves united in their bewilderment. Why would American civilians, people whose sons and husbands were fighting German soldiers somewhere else in the world, want to give gifts to their prisoners? Franz Weber, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had been drafted into the medical corps, lay on his narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. He remembered the letters from home, the ones that had reached him before his capture, describing the bombing raids over German cities, the food shortages, the constant fear. His own sister had written about American bombers flying over their neighborhood, about the sound of air raid sirens, about neighbors who had lost everything. And yet here, American families wanted to give Christmas presents to German soldiers. The skepticism ran deeper than simple mistrust. For many of these men, the concept challenged everything they had been taught about the nature of warfare, about the character of their enemies, about the fundamental assumptions that had shaped their understanding of the world. In the Nazi ideology that had surrounded them for over a decade, Americans were portrayed as decadent, materialistic, lacking in moral fiber and military discipline. They were the enemy not just in a political sense, but in a civilizational one. Friedrich Hoffmann, a sergeant from the Afrika Korps who still bore scars from the fighting in Tunisia, had spent the evening writing in a small notebook he had been allowed to keep. His thoughts, recorded in careful German script, revealed the internal struggle that many of the prisoners were experiencing. How does one make sense of this? We are their prisoners, taken in honorable combat. Yes, but still prisoners. We represent the army of a nation that has brought war to the world, that has occupied their allies, that continues to fight their sons and brothers in Italy and France. And yet they speak of gifts, of Christmas generosity, as if we were not enemies but simply men far from home. Is this weakness, strategy, or something else entirely? Something I am not equipped to understand. The morning brought crisp air and clear skies, but also an tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the camp. After breakfast and morning roll call, the prisoners were organized into groups and marched to the camp's recreation hall, a large wooden building that had been decorated with simple Christmas ornaments, and a small tree that guards had cut from a nearby field. What they saw when they entered stopped many of them in their tracks. Tables lined the room, covered with packages wrapped in colorful paper and tied with ribbons, hundreds of them, sorted roughly by size and type, each bearing a small tag written in English. The sight was overwhelming in its abundance, its cheerfulness, its complete contradiction to everything these men had expected from captivity. American guards stood beside the tables, not with weapons at the ready, but with clipboards and lists, prepared to distribute the gifts in an orderly fashion. The camp chaplain, Father O'Brien, a kindly Irish-American priest who had been conducting voluntary religious services in German, stood near the Christmas tree with a smile that seemed genuine, unforced. "Meine Herren," Sergeant Muller called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "The gifts are organized by type: clothing, books, writing materials and personal items. Each man may select one item from each category. Please form lines and proceed in order." The silence that followed was profound. 300 German soldiers stood frozen, staring at tables full of Christmas presents from people they had never met, people whose country they had been fighting against for over 4 years. The psychological weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Klaus Richter, Hans's younger brother who had been captured alongside him in Italy, was the first to move. Perhaps it was youth, or curiosity, or simply the inability to process what he was seeing, but he stepped forward tentatively toward the nearest table. His movement seemed to break a spell, and slowly, hesitantly, other prisoners began to follow. The first packages were opened with surgical care, as if the contents might explode or reveal some hidden trap. Hans watched his brother unwrap a thick woolen scarf, deep blue with a pattern of small white stars. Inside the package was a handwritten note in English, which Sergeant Miller translated. "For a German soldier far from home, may this keep you warm and remind you that even enemies can wish each other peace at Christmas. From the Morrison family, Alva, Oklahoma." The note circulated among nearby prisoners, each man reading it with expressions of growing bewilderment. Arne Schultz opened a package containing a small leather-bound book of German poetry, Goethe and Schiller, with an inscription that read, "Books belong to no nation. Literature is the common heritage of humanity. Merry Christmas from the Alva Public Library." Otto Brenner, the veteran who had been most suspicious the night before, found himself holding a hand-knitted pair of mittens and a bar of good soap wrapped in tissue paper. The accompanying note was simple: "My son is fighting somewhere in Europe. I hope someone shows him kindness too. God bless you, Mrs. Sarah Williams." As the distribution continued, the emotional atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. The initial suspicion and fear gave way to something more complex, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, shame, and a deep, unsettling recognition of shared humanity. These were not the gifts of victors to vanquished enemies, but offerings from one group of people to another, motivated by something that transcended national boundaries and military allegiances. Franz Weber, the former teacher, received a package containing writing paper, envelopes, and a fountain pen. The note inside, written in careful script, read, "Education and communication are bridges between peoples. Use these to write to your family, to keep learning, to remember that knowledge knows no borders." From the Ladies' Auxiliary of First Methodist Church, Alva, the gift struck him with unexpected force. Here were people who understood that he was more than just a German soldier, that he was a man with a mind, with family connections, with a need to maintain his intellectual life even in captivity. The recognition of his humanity, coming from people he had been taught to see as enemies, was almost overwhelming. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the hall underwent a remarkable transformation. The rigid military bearing of the prisoners began to soften. Men who had maintained strict discipline and emotional control since their capture found themselves struggling with feelings they couldn't easily categorize or suppress. Young Werner Schultz sat on a wooden bench, turning over and over in his hands a small wooden carving of a Christmas angel, handmade with obvious care and skill. The attached note explained that it had been carved by an elderly gentleman in town whose own grandson was serving in the Pacific. He wanted to make sure that every young man far from home had something beautiful to remind him of the season. The note read. The psychological impact was profound. For months these men had existed in a kind of emotional suspension, maintaining their dignity and discipline through rigid adherence to military protocols and fierce loyalty to their comrades. They had defined themselves in opposition to their captors, drawing strength from an us versus them mentality that helped them cope with the disorientation and helplessness of captivity. But gifts changed everything. Gifts implied relationship, implied care, implied a recognition of the recipient's worth as a human being rather than simply as a military unit or political symbol. The American families who had contributed these presents weren't responding to German soldiers or Nazi enemies. They were responding to young men far from home at Christmas, to fathers and brothers and sons who happened to be on the wrong side of a terrible war. Friedrich Hoffmann found himself staring at a small chess set, beautifully crafted from local wood, accompanied by a note that read, "Chess is the same in any language. Perhaps this will help pass the long hours and keep your mind sharp." From a fellow player who hopes someday we can compete across a board instead of across battle lines. Thomas Anderson, Alva High School. The sergeant who had led men in combat across North Africa, who had seen the worst of warfare and had maintained his composure through capture and imprisonment, felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time since he was a child. The gift represented something he had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of human connection that transcended conflict, of shared interests that could bridge even the most profound political divisions. The distribution took most of the morning, but no one seemed impatient. Guards who had initially prepared for possible incidents or disturbances found themselves serving more as facilitators than as watchmen. The Christmas gifts had created an atmosphere that was almost sacred in its intensity, a temporary suspension of the normal dynamics of captivity and control. Father O'Brien moved among the prisoners, offering blessing for those who wanted them, translating notes for men whose English wasn't sufficient, and serving as an informal counselor for those who seemed overwhelmed by the experience. His presence, warm and non-threatening, provided a kind of spiritual framework for men struggling to process what they were experiencing. Father Hans Richter approached the chaplain tentatively, holding a package that contained a thick sweater and a small wooden cross. "I don't understand. Why would they do this? We are their enemies. We have fought against their army, their allies. Some of us," he paused, struggling with the words, "some of us have done things in war that we are not proud of. And yet they give us gifts as if we were their own sons." Father O'Brien looked at the young German officer with eyes that held both compassion and understanding. "My son," he said in his careful German, "Christmas is about the recognition that we are all children of the same God, that love and mercy can exist even in the midst of hatred and war. These families understand something that politics and military strategy sometimes obscure, that you are human beings, that you have mothers who worry about you, that you celebrate the same holidays and long for the same peace that all people long for." The chaplain paused, choosing his words carefully. "This doesn't mean they approve of the war or forget what has happened. It means they refuse to let war completely destroy their capacity for compassion. It's not weakness. It takes great strength to show kindness to those who have been designated as enemies." As the day wore on and prisoners returned to their barracks with their gifts, a profound change had occurred in the social dynamics of the camp. Men who had maintained emotional distance from their captors and from the civilian population beyond the wire began to grapple with a new and unsettling reality. Their enemies were capable of extraordinary generosity, of seeing beyond nationality and military allegiance to recognize shared humanity. That evening, the barracks were filled with quiet conversations, as men examined their gifts more closely, read and reread the accompanying notes, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The initial suspicion had largely evaporated, replaced by a complex mixture of gratitude, confusion, and a deep questioning of assumptions they had held about the nature of their captivity and their captors. Werner Schultz sat on his bunk, carefully composing a letter to his mother in Germany. Liebe Mutter, he wrote, "Today something happened that I struggle to describe. The American families in the town near our camp gave us Christmas gifts, not because they had to, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they wanted to. I received a scarf, knitted by a woman whose son is fighting somewhere in Europe, and she wrote that she hopes someone shows him the same kindness." He paused in his writing, staring at the wall where other prisoners had hung small decorations and photographs from home. "I keep thinking about what this means. We are at war with these people. We have killed their soldiers, and they have killed ours. And yet at Christmas, they remember that we are human beings who miss our families and feel cold and loneliness, just as their own sons do in prisoner camps somewhere else." The letter continued, "I don't know what to think about this war anymore, Mutter. I still believe we fought honorably, that we did our duty as German soldiers, but I can no longer believe what we were told about our enemies. They are not the monsters we were taught to fight. They are people who can show mercy even to those who have fought against them. What does this say about everything we thought we knew?" Similar conversations were taking place throughout the camp. Otto Brenner, the veteran who had been most skeptical of American intentions, found himself engaged in long discussions with younger prisoners about the nature of warfare, about the difference between military necessity and human cruelty, about the possibility that enemies could maintain honor, decency, even in conflict. In Russia, he told a group of men gathered around the small stove in his barracks, "We saw what war could do to people, how it could strip away everything human and leave only brutality. I learned to expect the worst from everyone, because that was usually what you got. But this," he gestured toward the packages still being opened and examined around the room, "this is something different. This is people choosing to remain human even when they have every reason to become something else." The psychological impact extended beyond individual prisoners to affect the dynamics of the entire camp. Guards noticed that the normal tensions and occasional conflicts that arose in any prison environment seemed to diminish after the gift distribution. Men who had been sullen or resistant became more cooperative, not out of fear or calculation, but from a genuine shift in their understanding of their situation. The gifts had accomplished something that months of proper treatment and adherence to Geneva Convention standards had not fully achieved. They had created a sense of human connection between captors and captives, a recognition that decency could exist even within the framework of military necessity and national conflict. Franz Weber, in his continuing journal entries, struggled to articulate the transformation he was experiencing. "We came here as German soldiers, defined by our allegiance to the fatherland, our military training, our shared experience of combat and capture. But the gifts force us to see ourselves as they see us, not as German soldiers, but as young men far from home, as sons and brothers and fathers, as human beings who deserve compassion even in captivity." He continued, "This recognition is both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful, because it offers hope that humanity can survive even the worst conflicts, that love can exist alongside hatred, that enemies can acknowledge each other's essential dignity. Terrible, because it forces us to question everything we thought we knew about the nature of this war, about the character of our enemies, about the beliefs and assumptions that led us to this point." As Christmas Day approached, the impact of the gifts became even more profound. Prisoners who had received warm clothing wore it proudly, not just for physical comfort, but as a tangible reminder of the kindness they had experienced. Those who had received books shared them freely, creating informal reading groups and discussion circles that brought men together across regional and ranked divisions. The chess set that Friedrich Hoffmann had received became the center of a small tournament that attracted players from throughout the camp. Men who had barely spoken to each other found themselves engaged in friendly competition, bonded by the shared gift from Thomas Anderson, and the recognition that intellectual pursuits could transcend political boundaries. The writing materials that Franz and others had received enabled a flood of correspondence with families back in Germany. But more than just practical communication, these letters carried new perspectives on the war, on captivity, on the nature of their enemies that began to filter back to the German homeland. "The Americans are not what we were told," Hans Richter wrote to his parents. "They follow rules of war that seem to come from genuine conviction rather than mere calculation. They treat us with firmness, but also with dignity. And now they're civilians, people who have no military obligation to treat us well, have shown us kindness that I struggle to understand or explain." These letters, when they reached Germany through international Red Cross channels, carried a message that contradicted official propaganda about American brutality and barbarism. Family members who received them faced their own crisis of understanding as they tried to reconcile the reality their sons and husbands described with the narrative they had been given about the nature and character of Germany's enemies. The gifts also created practical changes in daily camp life. Men who had received art supplies began decorating barracks walls with murals and sketches that transformed the sterile military environment into something more human and personal. Those who had received musical instruments formed small ensembles that provided entertainment for their fellow prisoners and helped maintain morale during the long winter months. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological and spiritual. The recognition that their enemies were capable of extraordinary kindness forced many prisoners to confront fundamental questions about the nature of the war they had been fighting, about the ideology that had shaped their understanding of the world, about their own role in events that had brought such devastation to Europe. Otto Brenner, in a letter to his wife, tried to express the complexity of his feelings. "Liebe Anna, I want you to know that we are treated well here, better perhaps than we deserve given what this war has cost both our peoples. But more than that, I want you to understand that our enemies are not the demons we were told they were. They are people like us, with families and hopes and fears, people who can show mercy even to those who have fought against them." He continued, "This doesn't mean I regret serving my country, or that I think our cause was entirely wrong, but it means I can no longer see this conflict as a simple struggle between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism. It's more complicated than that, more human than that, and recognizing the humanity of our enemies somehow makes me feel more human myself." As winter deepened and Christmas passed, the effects of the gift-giving continued to resonate throughout the camp. The initial shock and bewilderment gave way to a deeper understanding of what had taken place. The American families had accomplished something remarkable. They had demonstrated that even in the midst of a global war, human decency could survive, that compassion could cross national boundaries, that enemies could recognize each other's essential humanity. For many of the German prisoners, the experience became a defining moment in their understanding, not just of Americans, but of the possibilities for human behavior even under the most challenging circumstances. They had been given a gift far more valuable than warm clothing or books or writing materials. They had been given a glimpse of a different way of thinking about conflict, about enemies, about the possibilities for mercy and understanding even in the darkest of times. The memory of that Christmas morning, of packages wrapped in colorful paper and notes written by strangers who saw them not as enemies, but as fellow human beings far from home, would stay with them long after the war ended. For many, it would influence their understanding of reconciliation, of the possibility for former enemies to become friends, of the capacity for human beings to choose compassion over hatred, even when they have every reason to do otherwise. Years later, when these men returned to Germany and helped rebuild their country, when they worked to establish new relationships between Germany and America, when they raised children and taught them about the war, many would trace their understanding of the possibilities for peace and reconciliation back to that morning in an Oklahoma prisoner of war camp, when American families chose to give Christmas gifts to German soldiers. The gifts had been simple: scarves and books, mittens and writing materials, chess sets and wooden crosses, but their impact was profound, demonstrating that even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, the capacity for love, mercy, and recognition of shared humanity could survive. They had learned that enemies could choose to see each other not as abstractions to be hated or defeated, but as individual human beings deserving of dignity and compassion. That lesson, learned in captivity from people they had never met, and would likely never see again, would prove to be one of the most valuable gifts any of them had ever received.